The webinar will be presented by Tim Kelsall and Nikolai Schulz. I'm going to introduce them in turn. So Tim Kelsall is a senior research fellow in the Politics and Governance program at the Overseas Development Institute, London. He specializes in political economy analysis and political anthropology and has interests in governance, democracy, transitional justice, economic growth, education, and health. Prior to joining ODI, Tim taught politics and development studies at Oxford and Newcastle universities and edited the journal African Affairs. Tim is currently co-director of research at the Effective State and Inclusive Development Research Center, ESID in short, and political settlements research director, the African Cities Research Consortium. I would also like to introduce Nikolai Schulz. Nikolai is a postdoctoral research associate at Humboldt University in Berlin, in the Department of Agriculture Economics, where he studies the politics of bioeconomic strategies across the globe. Prior to that, Nikolai worked as a research associate at the University of Manchester's ESID Research Center, and he recently received his PhD from analyses Department of International Development. Together with Tim, Nikolai co-led this particular project of which we're going to hear about, defining and measuring political settlements program. A couple of housekeeping rules from our side. First, if you were to ask questions, use a chat function, and I might then ask you to ask the question live, but I need to see the question first in the chat function. Very helpful for me. And secondly, just to note that this webinar is being recorded, and obviously be available later on if you want to hear it again. So without further ado, Tim, if you don't mind speaking for about 25 minutes, and 30 minutes, and I will let you remind you when you close to the allotted time. And after that, we'll have Q&A for approximately 30 minutes. So Tim, over to you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Cornell, and thank you to everybody for coming. So most of those of you who are here are, I'm sure, familiar with the ESID Research Centre, and in particular with its phase 1 work on political settlements and development outcomes in fields such as growth, health, education, social protection, and women's empowerment. But today I'm going to concentrate on the defining and measuring political settlements workstream, which was really a cornerstone of ESID's phase 2 work. This grew out of a concern that there were some ambiguities in the way in which political settlements were being defined in the field, and also the fact that there were no clear guidelines for measuring political settlements. And this made a rigorous comparison across cases difficult. So ESID set out to rectify this by providing a slightly tweaked definition of a political settlement, and also a new database on political settlements focused on the Global South. Now, I've already spoken and published quite a bit elsewhere about how we redefined political settlements. So in this presentation, I want to spend more time talking about the database itself. The database is or will be a global public good, and I want to highlight some of the ways in which we've begun to use it, and also some of the ways in which it could be used by others in the future. So how did we construct the database? Nikolai, if you could go to the next slide. So to begin with, we realized that we didn't have the resources to survey every country in the world, so we set some limiting criteria. This was especially important as we initially intended to use this database to conduct a QCA, meaning that we wanted to ensure that the countries were at least loosely comparable. So as a result, we deliberately chose countries that at independence, or 1946, whichever was later, had been resource poor, British, predominantly rural coastal colonies, above and below a certain population size and below a certain level of national income. And this yielded us Ghana, Kenya, Malaysia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Tanzania. So we put these countries and then the original ESID countries, or shall we say some of the key ESID countries together. That is Uganda, Rwanda, Zambia, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. we put these together and used them to road test and refine the survey instrument. And then subsequently, we relaxed the British criterion, the British colony criterion, and the upper population limits. And that gave us a caseload of 42 countries, which you can see highlighted in orange in the diagram there. So how did we choose experts? Well, I should say at first that we realized that no individual scholar would have the breadth of knowledge to answer this survey by themselves. And also that to answer the survey required quite in-depth knowledge of the politics and development of the political economy of these particular countries. So we decided it had to be an expert survey. And finding experts was really one of the most difficult parts of the process. And what we generally did was we looked at databases in Google Books and citations indexes to find scholars who were published, preferably extensively, in the fields of politics, political economy, or political history. And sometimes we were able to draw on our personal networks here as well, for instance, people who are already in the or associated with the ESID program. So for each country, we compiled a short list, and then we approached the people who seemed to us, on the basis of their reputation, to be most qualified, and thus at the top of that list. And where people turned us down, which was maybe half to 2/3 of the respondents, we worked our way down the list. So the list is undoubtedly biased towards male northern experts, a fact which I'm afraid represents the distribution of knowledge and publishing power in the industry. I have to say that we only really looked at publications in English. There is a possibility then that had we more deliberately targeted Southern scholars and or women, that we would have got a better or simply different quality of data. For what it's worth, the differences between the women and Southern scholars we did survey and their male Northern counterparts were not obvious. We did get a few incommensurable type codings, for instance, Haiti and Vietnam spring to mind as cases. But the people making these incommensurable type codings were not actually Southern researchers. They were also male Northern researchers. Nevertheless, we're thinking about ways of making the database more inclusive by making it into more of a wiki. But we've not yet come up with a solution that combines inclusivity with quality control. I don't think that you can have a completely open door policy to editing the data set, I'm afraid. Anyway, I think we should note that most of the variables we asked about were quite intangible or unobservable. We were therefore asking for expert opinions or educated inferences on the basis of a diversity of evidence, which in some cases would be quite thick and plentiful, and in others, rather scant. And some experts struggled with this, but we had self-assessed confidence questions and other sections where they could raise concerns to help mitigate this problem, though we're under no illusion that the data is perfect. And I think we should also note that experts sometimes clustered together and sometimes diverged quite significantly in the codings that they made. We had a fairly sophisticated system for weighting responses, which we think provides a defensible average of the coder's responses. Please note that these methods were chosen independently of our research hypotheses. And the result is that you may not entirely like or agree with the way we've coded one country or another. However, I think the process is undoubtedly less subject to confirmation bias than that of the lone researcher making his or her own qualitative assessment of the data. So if you could turn to the next slide, Nikolai. What kinds of questions did we ask? Well, the survey asked questions under 6 headings. The settlement's configuration of power, bloc's relationship to the settlement, decision-making and implementing power of the leadership, foreign influence and internal and external threats, economic organizations, and economic and social policy. The average country in our dataset is covered for 61.77 years. It had 8.59 distinct leaders and 14.31 political periods. Then we have over 100 raw political economy variables and several dozen indices that span 2,718 country years. So to expand a little on these, first of all, the settlement's configuration of power. Well, standing on the shoulders of Mushtaq Khan, we conceptualized each polity in terms of power relations among three blocks. The leaders block, a contingently loyal block, that is rival factions of the ruling or governing coalition, and an opposition block, that's those people who did not feel represented by the governing coalition or were simply disengaged from politics. And it's this three block structure which renders our survey distinct, we think, from other sophisticated political science databases such as VDEM or the Quality of Governance survey. We asked coders about the size and social composition of these different blocks. We asked about their strength relative to one another in the eyes of the leader and their internal power relations. And the answers to these questions allowed us to craft what we call a power concentration variable. On the second, we examined the block's relationship to the political settlement, specifically whether they were mainly co-opted, repressed, or some combination of the two. We also asked about what types of co-optation or repression predominated. And the answers to these questions allowed us to estimate the size of what we call the settlement's social foundation. The social foundation being the powerful groups that the leadership attempts to co-opt in the interests of political survival and settlement reproducibility. We think this variable is also novel and not perfectly captured by any existing poli-sci databases. So at the next four sections, C attempted to get a handle on one of our key intermediate or causal mechanisms, that is the concentration of decision-making and implementing power in the leadership. And D looked at possible alternative or additional variables. I'm sorry, someone keeps pinging me. I'm going to try and shut down my Outlook. Where was I? I was talking about
foreign influence
the decision-making and influencing power of the leadership. And then we were looking at, D looks at possible alternative or additional variables that might explain our observed outcomes, things like external dependence, elite threat perceptions, and so on. E looked at economic organizations, and that was mainly focused on gathering data that would allow us to test some of the Carnian hypotheses about industrial policy outcomes and the political power and technical sophistication of local capitalists, while F looked for data on another of ESID's causal mechanisms, that is elite commitment to inclusive development policy. Now, Nikolai, maybe if you could now just sort of flash up our code book and scroll through a few of these variables and indices, you might be able to see some of the, I think, incredible richness of the data that we've captured.
Yeah, I mean, basically, again, just looking at the table of contents of our code book, you really see that there's, and these are just the indicators, the raw indicators coming from the survey questions. You really see a whole ton of indicators. So to mention, those are 101 indicators. And then using those, as Tim mentioned, we created a range of different indices, basically following the core structure of the survey and really trying to build what we then also used in the book project. So for example, the power concentration variable that Tim just mentioned, And you see that there's a range of sub-indices going into that. For example, the horizontal power dimension of Kahn's configuration of political power typology, and here's the vertical dimension, and those then are aggregated into the power concentration index. You'll see we often have different versions of an index. They are then aggregated using different methodologies, and this is always explained in more detail in here. But apart from the power concentration index, we have the social foundation size index and all the different subcomponents. And you can really see that there's quite a lot of variables and indices actually going into each main index. It's quite complex, but we feel that if you follow the code book, you get a pretty good understanding of it. And we always try to be pretty clear and intuitive in the book and in the papers that we are currently writing. And then eventually we combine both the power concentration index and the social foundation index into what we call the ESID political settlement index. And again, there are different variations thereof. Some are at an interval scale and some are at an ordinal 4-category scale. And those are quite crucial for especially the book. And again, a range of other interesting indices on the distribution, equality or inequality between blocks of material benefits in society, a range of different threat level indices, which then come together in what we call the systemic threat variable, which refers to donor adult systemic vulnerability concept and tries to really measure that, which is quite novel in the political economy literature. And again, just concluding, we have indices on the business configuration, how powerful businesses are and how capable they are. This really speaks to Mushtaq Khan's second core configuration in his work on the economic configuration, I think is what he calls it. And then lastly, really a range of quite interesting economic policy indices. So for example, how export or oriented or import substituting oriented industrial policy was, how foreign direct investment oriented it was, and kind of aggregating this into one economic policy index. But you see the structure of aggregation here and really quite a richness of different political economy indicators and indices that we built. All right.
Okay, thanks very much, Nikolai. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, what kinds of analyses have we already run on this data set? So we've done some descriptive work with the data set. If you go to the next slide, what that slide is showing you is a snapshot of power concentration among our countries in 2017, with the greener countries having the highest power concentration and the red countries having the lowest power concentration. And the next slide is showing you the evolution of power concentration and social foundation size cross-nationally over time. And then the next slide shows you the evolution of those variables within selected countries. No, sort of back one slide, actually, Nikolai. Yeah, that's the evolution of those variables over time. Okay, so then if we go to the next slide, ESID's been using the database to test causal relations between its two main variables, social foundation and power concentration, and various development outcomes, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So in our forthcoming book, for example, we picked 4 archetypal cases: Ghana, Rwanda, Cambodia, and Guinea, representing different quadrants of our 2x2 matrix. So if you look at this slide, it's showing you the average position of these countries relative to the average position of all other countries since 2000. And then if you click to the next slide, you'll see the evolution of those countries' political settlements since the 2000s, of those 4 countries' political settlements since the year 2000. And then if you click to the next slide, you'll see how these countries have been performing in terms of economic growth. And we find that narrow concentrated Cambodia has the highest per capita growth of 6%. Broad concentrated Rwanda is next with 5%. Ghana has 3.6% growth. And then finally, Guinea has 2.3% growth. And note also that the pattern of growth in Cambodia was also arguably more exclusionary than that in Rwanda, reflecting the narrowness of its settlement and its relative inattention to social concerns. So this kind of data really sort of supports the main thrust of our ESID hypotheses. We go to the next slide, and this measures public health spending. And as might be expected, for most of the period, the two broad settlements, Ghana and Rwanda, have higher public health spending as a percentage of GDP than the two narrow settlements, Cambodia and Guinea. However, if we click to the next slide on maternal mortality reduction, there's some evidence to suggest that that spending is more effective in Rwanda and Cambodia, the more concentrated settlements. And indeed, we have good qualitative data to back up this story, which demonstrate more effective monitoring and accountability mechanisms in Cambodia, and especially in Rwanda. The story is a little bit complex in Cambodia because much of the monitoring and accountability is outsourced to NGOs, but I mean, that is an interesting story in itself. Now, turning to the next slide, we've also run a regression analysis, testing the variables with a battery of controls against growth in per capita income, which is our proxy for economic development, and infant mortality reduction, which is our proxy for social development. And again, we found strong support for the ESID theory. Maybe if you have more questions about those results, we can come back to that later in Q&A. But generally, we found that our variables make a difference across regime types, and also that power concentration in particular explains growth better than conventional poli-sci variables such as polity 2. If we turn to, this slide, then we've also begun to explore relations between our key concepts and other poli-sci variables. So very briefly, looking at these charts, we see that narrow dispersed settlements are the ones that are most associated with conflict onset and coup propensity. We see that broad dispersed settlements are the most democratic, and narrow concentrated settlements are the least democratic. Nevertheless, broad concentrated settlements, which tend to do the best developmentally, do have a positive polity 2 score, although they wouldn't be, on average, counted as being fully democratic. Broad concentrated settlements also tend to do best just in terms of VDEM's rule of law and impartial bureaucracy indices, while broad concentrated and broad dispersed tend to do best in terms of average government effectiveness. And I think the finding for broad dispersed is maybe a little bit surprising here and maybe a little bit in conflict with some of ESID's hypotheses. So that's something that we might want to look at in a bit more detail. And in addition, we've examined the relationship between our variables and corruption, industrial growth, and so on. Okay, so turning to the next slide, please, Nikolai. What else could be done with this data set? Well, first of all, if you're interested in political settlements analysis, either the Carnian version or what we might call the ESIDian version, and you want to use it to explain outcomes in your country or in a handful of countries, you can use our codings to give you a head start on country classification and therefore on case selection. And the database, it can also help, I think, with case analysis, because as well as categorizing countries according to our variables, the database, it also provides some qualitative richness describing the social composition of the main factions in the country and their relationships to one another across time. Although I think there is a bit of variation in data quality in the data set here, with some countries and some coders providing much more detail than others. Second, you can explore angles that we've yet to explore. So for example, we've asked coders to code relatively powerful and powerless groups by gender. So you could use this data to link gender power to development outcomes. To give another example, you could combine data with other databases, for example, on peace agreements or something like that, to see if the depth and breadth of the settlement's social foundation is linked to the longevity of the resulting peace agreement. You could also conduct more fine-grained analyses of the relationship between settlement characteristics, not just settlement type, and settlement breakdown. You could also use it to explore the significance of de jure political institutions on power, politics, and development. And pushing the causal chain back, for example, researchers could investigate what predicts the emergence and maintenance of more or less powerful leaders and ruling coalitions. So they could, for example, study how distinct levels of party institutionalization or the introduction of national assemblies affect rulers' consolidation of power. Although to do that, you'd have to combine our data set with other data sources. Future research could also employ the dataset's many other variables, such as those on the severity of internal and external threats, to test Bellis's theories, for example, those of Donor and Ramsey, Besley and Persson and Knudsen, among others. And a further productive avenue might be to analyse how power configurations interact with countries' distinct economic policy choices to explain patterns of economic development. Next, you could use this data set to analyse the relationship between political settlement variables and a whole host of other development outcome variables. For instance, universal health coverage, quality of education, quality of public financial management, violent crime, state fragility, SDG progress, a whole range of things. Another line of inquiry might be, to what extent does power concentration correlate with authoritarianism? And which are the kind of concentrated countries which are non-authoritarian? Generally speaking, we think that if you dig into this database and take some time to explore it, you're likely to come up with all kinds of questions and hypotheses that we haven't even begun to think of. And then finally, scholars who wish to apply political settlements theory to a country that's not in our survey, they can now do so using our ready-made questionnaire. And indeed, we hope that in future, the database will be expanded to incorporate many more countries, including in the global north. So as such, I want to recommend the political settlements database to you as a rich resource, not just for political settlements research, but for politics and development research generally. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim, very much. That's absolutely perfect in terms of timing. I should introduce myself, actually, for those who don't know me. So I'm Kunal Sen, the director of UNI Wider. I'm also a professor of development economics at the University of Manchester. I was formerly joint research director of ESID with Sam Hickey. And I recall that when we were at the early years of ESID, we used to really struggle with the fact that when you look at other databases in political science, VDEM, policy, and so on, we didn't really feel that they captured what we wanted to capture in political settlements as a concept. And when this project started out with Tim and Nikolai, it seemed like a very ambitious project. And really, especially to bring country coders, the number of countries over time. So it seemed very ambitious. So it's so exciting to see where you are now with the database and what you're finding. And so I think that's remarkable what you've achieved in the last few years.